Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's political editor. Coming up on the show, who broke Britain? That's the question Kate Andrews tries to answer in this week's cover. And she'll be appearing on the show of Hamish McRae. The Texan Supreme Court has just upheld a law to ban the use of so-called gender-affirming care. Lionel Shriver will be on the show to explain. It's 1 year since Liz Truss became Prime Minister. We'll be thinking about the highs and the lows with James Heale, her biographer. John Keiger writes in this week's magazine about the collapse of Francofrique. He'll be on with Jonathan Githens-Mazer to tell us what went wrong for France. A year on from the Queen's death, how has the royal family changed? Robert Hardman will be on the show. And finally, former MP Chris Mullins reviews Rory Stewart's memoir in this week's magazine. Will Stewart make a return to frontline politics? Chris joins me to discuss. First up, schools are crumbling, NHS waiting lists are millions long, and trains never seem to run on time. What happened to Britain? Kate Andrews writes this week's cover, Broken Britain, and she joins me now alongside the economist Hamish McRae. Kate, Hamish, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. Kate, you write about Broken Britain in your cover piece. Why is Britain broken?
Well, the popular narrative is that it was the Tory cuts, the years of austerity, that every problem we can point to now, crumbling concrete, can't see your GP, roads aren't fixed up, airports in chaos, rail systems not working, fundamentally comes down to those years of cuts. And this week's cover piece takes a slightly different perspective. It looks at those cuts, but it notes that fundamentally we are spending more and taxing more than essentially ever before. Not ever before, but taxes are at a record 70-year high.
Getting close to it.
We're spending more than Tony Blair was spending, Gordon Brown was spending. Money is not the issue. There's so much money being funneled into the Treasury and being funneled back out. It's not so much a question of spending cuts, but where those cuts were performed and what was prioritized. And the piece goes back into the Brown years, into the Cameron and Osborne years, and talks mainly about capital spending, the fact that it's really easy to cut capital spending because you can just about keep it going for quite a long period of time. You won't notice that the roof's about to cave in for a long time. You won't notice that things are breaking down until you have an issue like we had this week with schools, where actually the parents of 150 schools, their children were told that they couldn't return because it was too dangerous. So what Brown did, what Brown planned to do, and what Cameron implemented was that chipping away at the capital budgets so that they could pour the money into things like health, pensions, and welfare, the politically sensitive and popular areas that people always want more money for. It's essentially short-termism at its worst because it's bribing voters, not telling them about the investments that need to be made down the road. And the irony, as I point out in the piece, is that I think a lot of these politicians probably thought, well, I'll be long gone by the time that these things start to break down. And that's somewhat true, but the Tory government's still here. And 13 years on, Rishi Sunak is having to explain why these decisions weren't made more than a decade ago, because the Tories are still in charge. And had they done some of those crucial investments and reprioritized funding and had tougher conversations with the public then, Rishi Sunak could, in theory, be taking credit right now for new infrastructure programs, for better schools. Instead, he's having to defend why the country's falling apart.
Hamish, what do you think about that central argument from Kate, which is effectively short-term spending is prioritised over long-term spending by successive governments, partly because of the election cycle and so forth? Do you think that's the big problem here?
I think the piece is spot on. It's great that you should be on the cover, so you've got a winner there.
Thank you so much.
And it's
Come
exactly but no, there isn't about coming. I think I would take the thing back even further. This idea that you can always cut the capital budget, but it's very, very tough politically to cut goes back to, the 60s, the 50s, maybe not the 50s. The 50s, we did spend a lot of capital budget on building homes, public housing that had to be pulled down 25 years later. But a lot of these schools were built in the 50s and 60s, and there was money there for capital, just we spent that capital very badly. We cut corners. And I think if you look at one of the big arguments for privatisation was that actually if private companies were doing the investment, it wouldn't be cut back every time there was a crisis and the Treasury said, we got no money. And in some sense, I'd cut us a bit more slack. I mean, some things have worked. We didn't do the railways well, but actually double the number of people are travelling on railways now than they were before they were privatised. I think that's a bigger increase than in any developed country in the world. I stand to be corrected on that one, but I can't find one quickly. So I think we should recognise that this is an old problem, and it's a recurring old problem. And then the next question is, how do we fix it?
That is such an important point, because water is a really good example right now. A lot of people argue, well, there just hasn't been enough investment in water infrastructure. It needs to be taken back into the public sector. And, my big question with that is investment certainly has gone up since water was privatized. But more than that, if water were brought back into the public sector, are you really trying to tell me that we would start diverting money from the NHS and day-to-day spending on doctors and nurses' salaries to invest in water infrastructure? There's no way that would happen. So by no means would I argue that, this should all be in the hands of the state and they should just be more efficient. And well, they should be more efficient. That's a separate point. But that this is just a simple issue that the state didn't prioritize properly. The private sector has such an important role and an accountable role to play here too. But in the areas where actually we now should have been talking about reform for a very long time, pensions, welfare, the NHS, the Tory government in particular has been so hesitant to do that. Tony Blair was better at NHS reform than any of the Tory prime ministers have been, and there are political reasons for that, but the situation we now find ourselves in is between the Department of Health and Department for Work and Pensions, roughly, you can pretty much slot the money into those two departments, they account for 40% of public spending. And that number is only going to increase because the demands around changing demographics, around healthcare, around welfare, around aging are going to demand more money. So long as you don't touch that and you won't talk about that, do not expect tons of new schools to be built. Do not expect amazing upgrades, because there's a lot of money and it's being funneled into very particular areas.
Yeah, I think following that through, we got to segment. There is a national health problem. How do we fund that? There is a how do we build schools problem. There is a what's gone wrong with water problem. There's a what do we do with rail? So why aren't we building enough roads?
Like it's all
problem.
broken.
So I think you've got to segment.
Yeah.
Why aren't we building more homes? And that goes back to the 47 Town and Country Planning Act. So I mean, I think you've got to, when we say everything is going badly, I think we've got to say lots of little things are all going badly, and there are lots of step back. Lots of pretty big things are going badly, but we ought to recognise where we've had reasonable success stories. And if you want one, I mean, I think I would cite airports. A very absurd thing to say now. But if you look, London, more people fly, or at least they did before the pandemic, in and out of London, 6 airports, than any other place on earth. And they by and large got in and got out all right, and it wasn't very expensive. Yeah, I think that we don't celebrate that. We don't realise that actually pretty darn difficult to get all those people in and all out without all the planes crashing.
Of course, we did just have air traffic control, so some people who've recently been at airports may have a different view of an airport just in their immediate memory. But then, Hamish, I do wonder, you are being an absolute ray of light on today's segment and quite optimistic. So I'll do some shameless advertising, Broken Britain. Do you think it's a bit too negative?
Well, I think it's
a bit broken.
Look, many years ago, I used to edit a magazine, and I think it's a great cover. So get that one out of the way. The job is to sell it.
That's a really diplomatic answer.
I do think that we should be very careful in criticising things that have gone wrong. And actually, this was implicit on your point about water. Not to try and think there's a simple solution and that everything is terrible. In the case of water, the reason it was privatised was the public sector wasn't putting in enough money. And quite a bit more money was put in by the private sector. They then had a very bad control system. They all ripped it all out. But I do think a lot of investment has taken place. The London Ring Main. So I think that I would like to see us, and maybe your readers will, cut a little bit of slack for governments, for the country, if not for this government, or even more so for previous governments.
I do say in the piece that in normal times, although what are normal times these days, but you can imagine a world where if this were the main crisis, it would be very bad, but also considered manageable. People would say schools, yes.
Because it's about 1% of current schools that have RAC.
Exactly. And even if that number goes up, and we expect that it might, even if it went up by several hundred, you would be able to say, look, this is a terrible situation, a dangerous situation. We can manage it. The problem is that you are managing that on top of a 7.6 million waiting list on the NHS. You are managing that on top of an economy that it turns out actually grew much faster than we originally thought, but is still rather stagnant and really not developing. You're dealing with this on top of a productivity crisis. You're dealing with this on top of so many things that people feel are going wrong. And I think, to turn this to the politics slightly, one of the problems that the Tory government has is, even if I think it could be generally accepted that this particular set of politicians is not responsible for the concrete crisis, but if you put to people, do you feel like things are working? Everyone will have something to point to say no. And I think that's the problem, is that these crises, these scandals build up, and something that could have been manageable all of a sudden seems like it's not, because it is on top of something else.
So to end this segment, to you both, what, I suppose, starting you, Hamish, what do you think when we talk about how to fix many of these problems, or, we're going into an election year, potentially a regime change if the polls are anything to go by. What are the lessons we need to learn from kind of putting off these kind of long-term solutions?
I think the big lesson for politicians is going to be very difficult to be a politician in any Western economy over the next 15 years, because there will be no money for any of them. Aging populations everywhere. UK actually aging slightly slower than most countries, and population rising here was actually falling. So this is going to be a bad time to be a politician whose message is, we can fix it. I think, therefore, what clever politicians will do is to say, we can fix this and this. This is our job. What we can't fix is that and that, and we are having other agencies and other centres of power to do that. Just as in the early 90s, politicians said, we are not doing very well at controlling inflation, setting interest rates, and round the world, central banks were given that task to run monetary policy. And I think something like that sort of switch, where politicians have to say, we're not doing well, let's figure out another way of doing it, and we will do what we can do well. We've got other people to do those other things. I think something like that will happen in a lot of areas, including things like schools and probably the NHS.
That's a strong case for a royal commission for the NHS, actually, just to say, look, we are not getting anywhere on the politics of this. Let's try to take some of the heat out of it.
Yeah.
As I say in the piece, there's no particularly good way to frame what's happening now for the Tory party, but you could argue that Rishi Sunak has a slight advantage here, because he lost a leadership election last year basically on this theme. Not every problem that we're talking about now, but on this idea of fairy tales and the fact that you just cannot overpromise, because you will severely disappoint, which is a good thing to bring up in the week of when Liz Truss took power last year, and the 49 days that followed. He is able to make this case. People didn't want to hear it last year. Still not totally sure they want to hear it this year, but it does seem that going into party conference season, this idea of long-termism is going to be a theme for him and his government, looking at what needs to be done for the next 10 to 15 years. It's a hard sell to your party, because it's not necessarily going to win you the next election, but it is totally necessary for the country to get back on track.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Hamish. And thank you for joining Spectator TV today. Next, Lionel Shriver writes a column this week about a decision by the Texan Supreme Court to ban so-called gender-affirming care. What is gender-affirming care, and why does Lionel think it was a good idea to ban it? She joins me now. You write in your column this week about a decision by the Supreme Court in Texas. Can you tell us about that?
Well, there have been a number of Republican-dominated legislatures that have passed laws banning so-called gender-affirming care for minors. It's not making it illegal to get sex change operations and medical treatment for adults. It's all about kids. And there have been states such as Florida where the courts have struck these laws down as a violation of so-called trans kids' civil rights. But I observe in the column that we deny all kinds of what we might call rights to children routinely. We don't let them work in factories, buy cigarettes, buy alcohol, get married, or have sex with adults. And that's actually a much longer list, but nobody objects that it's not fair that kids can't buy cigarettes. So I think this is falsely framed as a civil rights issue. So I'm looking at the decision in Texas where the state Supreme Court upheld the law, and that's made progressives hysterical, as usual.
Because the default position before this would have allowed children to get that gender-affirming help.
Well, there's now an entire industry which is moving shocking numbers of children into a pathway which is almost inevitably going to lead to permanent medicalization for the rest of their lives, and often life-changing, irreversible, and I would say mangling surgery. So it's not a small matter. It's more advanced in the U.S. and more culturally entrenched and than in the U.K. And while especially continental Europe is starting to move away from this as maybe not the best way to treat confused underage people, for the U.S. it's become a political cause. So, and I think, I think we're in the midst of a major medical scandal that we will look back on in much the same way that we look back on giving people lobotomies to solve their mental illness. I just think the results are ghastly. The truth is that most children who are unhappy with their sex grow out of it. And the main thing that they need to do is go through puberty, and that's what gender-affirming care won't let you do. You're put on puberty blockers. And that itself is medically highly dubious, can lead to bone thinning, and it inhibits mental development. That puberty it may be confusing, it may be often unpleasant, and it feels like your body's being taken over, which it is. It's being taken over by adulthood, but it's medically vital, and we started interfering with it at scale without any real research on what the consequences are. And I think that down the road, we're probably going to be looking at class action suits by a lot of very unhappy young adults who want to come to some understanding as to how they were allowed to do this or why this was done to them. We don't let children make major decisions for themselves for a good reason. They don't know what they're doing. They haven't been around long enough to make life-changing decisions of this order. And of course, a lot of the problem is parents. So I don't think that we should be letting parents make these decisions on behalf of children either, because it's not their lives that are at risk. Their ability to have children that are at risk, or their ability even to reach orgasm in adulthood.
And to that point you mentioned just then, which is the fact that if you look across the world, it seems as though in Europe and UK, slightly retreating from some of these positions, or at least not going as all in. And I just wondered, why do you think it has become so politicized in the US? Is it political parties? Is it becoming part of a culture? Or what is it that's got it to that point?
I think it's the success of civil rights in relation to everyone else. It's all they could find. They need, when you have been broadly successful in relation to race. I mean, not to whitewash racial relations in the U.S., but in terms of the law, that's pretty ironed out. The only kind of racial discrimination that's legal is affirmative action, and I wouldn't do that either. Another topic. But I think most of all, it was the success of the same-sex marriage movement, and that was that stood up in the Supreme Court. So that is over. So there's nothing wrong with being gay. Can't be discriminated against for being gay. So there was just this desperation for a new cause, and I thought it was not a coincidence that right on the heels of widespread acceptance of same-sex marriage, suddenly came up this weird obsession with transgenderism, and therefore a new population that needs protection from bigotry.
And what is the argument from those activists who see that ruling in Texas and, as you say, are appalled by it? Do you understand at all where they're coming from?
I am familiar with the rhetoric. Yes, it's supposedly a matter of children's rights, and it's they portray these laws as anti-LGBTQIA+, whereas it has nothing to do with all those other letters. It's only about the T. So it makes it seem like this is a huge broadside on the rights of a vast number of people, whereas it concerns a much more specific population. And furthermore, they like to claim that these laws are in service of genocide, because supposedly if you do not provide gender-affirming care to people who identify as trans, then they're going to kill themselves. And there is no good evidence for this. The suicide rate before and after transition among this population is exactly the same. So getting gender-affirming care is not going to keep people from killing themselves anymore. And furthermore, while there's plenty of propaganda out there claiming that up to like 50% of the trans population kills themselves, this is rubbish. If you look at one study at Tavistock, it's 4 out of 15,000. Now, that's probably 4 too many. I agree. But it's not 50%.
Yeah, I suppose going back to the point you made earlier, which is about, how you can imagine a world where there's actually lots of class actions in the future from those who, when they are children, are given gender-affirming treatment, and then for some of the, the permanent features of that, could then, take action or be very unhappy in retrospect. Do you think there's also a portion of that group, people who do, children who are given this, who actually will get to the point that they are happy they had it, and in those cases, perhaps the gender-affirming treatment is what they need, or do you think it just shouldn't really be there for anyone until they reach adult age?
I agree. There are probably going to be a handful of people who are happy with the results. And a legislative solution is a crude tool, honestly. And I can see why doctors would be unenthusiastic about laws banning certain kinds of treatment, and it means that you can't be as individual in your decisions, but they're not taking decisions individually. They're taking a blanket approach so that they do give exactly the same treatment to everyone. And that's what gender-affirming care is all right. There is only one way to treat this, and that is to basically go through a sex change. And I think long ago with this phenomenon, we passed the point where it's just, the people who are unhappy with the sex they were born are coming out of the woodwork and being, because they're going to be more accepted. This is way beyond that. This is a raging social fad, which is especially taken hold in schools. And the people who are most vulnerable to it have many other mental health problems, may have social problems, maybe don't fit in. This is an instant way to get huge amounts of attention, and as the expression has it, affirmation. Who doesn't want affirmation? And it means your parents are going to be doting on you, your teachers are going to be doting on you. The way this is now constructed, the trans kids are sanctified in the social milieu at school. It's incredibly seductive. So we're dealing with a massive social contagion, which is possibly doing a lot of medical harm. And that's why I think legislation coming in and saying this has to stop is a good idea, partly because the American Medical Association and the American Pediatric Academy is all in with this stuff. So you can't count on the medical establishment to put brakes on.
And just final question, you mentioned in your piece about Karina Cohn, I wonder if you could just tell viewers about that case.
Karina Cohn, who now goes by Corey, transitioned at the age of 19 in 1994. And he still identifies as a so-called transsexual, which is the term we used to use. He accepts now that he is male and has always been male. He regards his transition as a failed fantasy. In fact, he emphasizes that this is not even about treating a mental illness. It is about fulfilling someone's fantasy. And it's a false fantasy. You can't change sex. And I would say, furthermore, well, if you do manage to change sex, what have you accomplished? It is not a meaningful achievement in the world. And I don't think that, because I don't believe sex explains identity or should really be all of your identity. Even if you manage to switch sides, that's a very broad category and it doesn't get you anywhere as a person. But this Corey Cohn is one of the people who testified before the state legislature in support of the bill. And he's now on a campaign specifically to ban pediatric transition.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you for joining Spectator TV. A year ago, Liz Truss was named as the winner of the Tory leadership contest and shortly entered number 10. However, she didn't stay there for very long. After the mini-budget, it was really a matter of time, and she eventually resigned before being pushed by MPs. So what went wrong, and was it doomed from the beginning? I'm joined now by James Heale, the Spectator's political correspondent and the author of her currently only biography. James, thank you for coming on Spectator TV this week. Quite a special week. 1 year since Liz Truss became Prime Minister. Of course, not currently Prime Minister. It didn't last too long. You co-authored a book about her time in power and the build-up to it. Any reflections coming up to a year on?
Happy Truss anniversary, yeah. 1 year ago, yesterday, she entered Downing Street. I think after a long summer leadership contest, and I suppose looking back on the subsequent 7 weeks that followed her entry to Downing Street, just what a stressful time they were for the country, and a personal interest here as well.
And I suppose, you've been going over, obviously, the research you did for your book, but also in various pieces this week, looking back on it. Do you think there were warning signs early on that this was not going to go as planned?
Yeah, I think that there was the global economic climate, of course, which was turning against low interest rates. But I think also we saw, do you remember over the summer months last year, there were some, for instance, policies that were quickly dropped because they weren't properly thought through, such as the suggestion perhaps that they were going to have regional pay differences, which meant that nurses' pay would effectively and teachers' pay would be less in different parts of the country. And that was quickly dropped. So there were kind of warning signs perhaps that some of the policy wasn't always kind of stress tested. And I think that obviously day one of the Truss government, she announced one of the biggest peacetime interventions in the market with the energy package, and then the Queen died. And so It was then thereafter we thought, oh, is that going to be the focus of, our book and etc. And I suppose really it was then, it went back to the economics, it never really recovered from that.
And as you say, that energy point's really interesting, because I think when people criticise the Truss premiership and Trussonomics, as it came to be known, they think about tax cuts. The tax cuts were in the mini budget. But part of the reason the markets were so spooked was because so much money had already been pledged on energy. So it was actually spending, as well as just, this idea of a conservatism that was mainly tax cuts.
Yeah, completely. And I think that, we would have seen a lot more of that kind of debate. But then, of course, Her Majesty died. And so I think a lot of awkward questions that would have been asked about the funding of that never got asked. And then suddenly it was all back into the mini budget. There was this thing rumbling along in the background. But that's ironic, isn't it, that one of Britain's most fervent free marketeers was announcing this huge energy package. And I'm sure, as Kate Andrews, our colleague, has written enough about, there was certain faults with that.
And I think one of the things when you listen to Liz Truss, and of course she gave her first interview to The Spectator after leaving Number 10, where she said, she had not behaved perfectly, which I think lots of people would agree with. But she did definitely think there were vested interests against her. And I think that she was taken aback that Tory MPs, some of them just never fully got behind her. Now, maybe that was naive, maybe it says something about those MPs, but do you think that was a factor too, that ultimately after that contest there were some MPs, such as, for example, you can look at Michael Gove, who I don't think was particularly helpful to Liz Truss, ultimately going after her on the first day of Tory party conference. Do you think there were a group of Tories that wanted her to fail from day one?
I think they certainly didn't want her particularly to succeed, if I could put it like that. I mean, obviously they would say that they wanted the country to succeed, etc. But there were certainly, I think, warning signs from the start. Now, Liz Truss, of course, didn't help herself, I'd say, probably by putting a lot of these people out of the cabinet. Some of the ministerial changes, a bit technical, but some of the Lords, for instance, getting rid of 2 former Theresa May aides just seemed perhaps a little bit too vindictive. And you see what she also did in terms of the kind of government machinery. But you're right, and I certainly think there's sort of acrimony there about how certain Tory MPs behaved, certainly in a public sense. And also, I think some of the triumphalism that some of the Trussites feel was exhibited by some of those who then sort of entered government and took cabinet jobs after October last year was not necessary or particularly edifying. And so I do think, regardless of the next election, those kind of tensions will linger behind the surface.
And for now, I think it's really hard to find anyone who thinks Rishi Sunak is not going to lead the Tories into the next election. But of course, one of the complaints you do hear, he's very managerial. Liz Truss may have got it wrong in terms of how she went about it, but she at least identified the need for change, the stagnation facing the country. So given there is still that school of thought in the Tory party, do you think in a world where perhaps the Tories somehow don't win the next election and there is a leader of the opposition contest, do you think there's anyone who could be perhaps not a successor to Truss, but at least be arguing more for her outlook on the economy? Who should we be looking out for?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just to say, I think the Trussites themselves, we refer to them as one homogenous group. Of course, there's different interpretations of what went wrong. And I was struck by an article by Simon Clarke last year talking about how they were going to have spending review of reductions between 5 to 10% in Whitehall to pay for the tax cuts. And then that sort of got jettisoned. And I think that he is doing some interesting work on the next generation Tories, which is clearly something the Conservative Party need to be worried about, the under 40s vote. So I think he will be interesting to see where he stands. I think also any members of her cabinet who remain loyal to her will be interesting. I think it depends also on how the Sunak government leads office. If it goes down to a terrible defeat, it'll be interesting to see people, if they reject that kind of lessons of Sunakism and say, well, real Trussonomics has never sort of been tried. So it's a debate to be playing out. But I think, Simon Clarke, and I think also perhaps looking at people like Ranald Wadner with the Conservative Growth Group and what they choose to intervene on over the next 12 months or so.
Thank you, James, for joining Spectator TV today. Spectator contributor Jon Keiger writes for this week's magazine about the recent coup in Gabon, in Africa, and gives his assessment about why many former French colonies on the continent are now politically volatile. To tell us more, Jon joins me now alongside Jonathan Githens-Mazer, a security expert from the University of Exeter. Jon, you write in the magazine this week about the collapse of Francofrique. There have now been 6 former French colonies with coups. Can you tell us about the latest?
Well, the latest one is Gabon. which is one of the richer of the French colonies in Africa. And it's a bit of a surprising one because many people hadn't really expected that to happen, or at least many French politicians hadn't expected that to happen. So this is really, in a way, signalling a general amount of discredit that's falling on all of the former Francophone African nations that were once part of the French Empire.
Jonathan, what do you think is driving this? To what extent do you think this is anti-French sentiment, or is it something else?
I think there's a number of things going on here at once. On the one hand, on the ground, there's definitely a sense of trying to combat the historic forces of colonialism, which these coups are kind of framed as. But simultaneously, I think it reflects a degree to which the French state itself is failing to handle these things, in part because of the failure of the foreign ministry and recent reforms that Macron has made over the past 2 years, the ambassadorial corps, and because of their inability to communicate exactly what a French agenda is in the Francophone world.
Jon, what's France's relationship like with its former colonies, and why is it important to still maintain influence and power?
Well, it's a long story, of course. The history of French imperialism is in many ways rather different to British imperialism. First of all, it should be said, I think, that the French Empire didn't really make any money, or at least it was loss-making until the late 1930s. So the French Empire was more of a prestige, had more of a prestige role than perhaps the British Empire. First of all, because France, after the French Revolution, had believed that it had reached a higher level of civilization, and it thought that it was appropriate that other nations should share in that, and therefore colonization seemed a logical thing to happen. Secondly, when the French lost the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, empire seemed a great way of compensating for that loss of national prestige. And then once again, after the Second World War, the defeat and occupation of France meant that the empire seemed at the end of the war to be a way of restoring its national prestige and international reputation. So decolonization became a very difficult thing to happen with so much prestige weighing on it. And that is one of the reasons why a number of, part of French decolonization was particularly bloody when in Indochina or in Algeria afterwards.
I think it's a brilliant point. And just to add to it, I think this becomes part of the disconnect for 21st century France, who views it through this historical lens, while simultaneously the countries in Francafrique, in Francophonie, don't really understand what the nature of the relationship is. They feel as though they're being sold a bill of goods to be civilizational without necessarily seeing what the benefits of that relationship are.
And Jonathan, on that, you mentioned some of the changes recently when it comes to diplomats in France. Does Macron want to keep these colonies close, the former colonies?
I don't know.
Priority?
It's difficult to say. I defer to the experts on French politics. I think there's little doubting the extent to which Macron has been distracted, certainly by domestic political issues and or European political issues. We've seen his attempts at diplomacy in the war with Ukraine, which haven't really necessarily netted the results I think that he would like to have seen on the global stage. But I think at the very least, from what one hears inside, there's a degree of apoplexy, of upset, of concern, and of shock, certainly within the foreign ministry and at the French political elite level.
And Jon, if France is missing in action or no longer having that influence, there are other countries, other governments that are keen to, for example, Russia and China. Can we expect them to make inroads, and what would they have to offer?
Yes, I think we can expect them to make inroads. They've already been doing that. China, of course, has invested largely across the African continent. And so France, as a traditional sort of provider of investment, is being overtaken. Secondly, Russia, which, as we know, with the Wagner mercenary armor, has been very active in Africa, and seemed to be, at some points anyway, doing a better job in pushing back the Islamic jihadists across the Sahel more effectively than it seemed the French were doing. And so the populations began to say, well, perhaps we're better off with the Russians. And Russian propaganda, of course, highlighted the fact that this was a kind of post-colonial empire that France was running, that these nations should be fully freed from the yoke of French imperialism. And consequently, those populations began to say France should leave, which it has asked, a number of states have asked for France to leave now, take out its troops. And they've also asked, certainly in Niger and in other places, they've asked for the French ambassador to be removed in a kind of symbolic gesture of down-facing France.
Yes, Jonathan, you often see those, when you're seeing video footage from some of the coups, Russian flags being waved or references to Putin.
I mean, I think going back for a second to one of the words you used in the last question was the word influence. What's interesting to note is that in French foreign policy, the word influence was highly discouraged, if not actively not allowed to be used until the past year. And so one of the legacies, as John referred to, in terms of this French post-colonial environment is a sense that there was an implicit deal, that the French state would defend potentially dodgy rulers, send in the Foreign Legion if something went wrong, if that, and that was the kind of quid pro quo. What's happened since that point, and particularly after France failed in Mali and has failed over the past 5 years to intervene in Mali, is that you have individuals, and I've spoken to friends in Gabon and Mali and in these kinds of places, who said, we don't really care who comes in as long as they get the terrorists. And the more that the kind of Russians, through Wagner and through its state apparatus itself, push on this open door, the more welcome they are made to feel by the local populations in some of these states.
So, John, I wondered, what do you think then are the consequences for the rest of Europe when it comes to France's mismanagement here on this issue, if it does allow, as you were setting out, Russia to have this influence?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the West, and Europe in particular, have played along with the French post-colonial game, if you like. They've supported it for all sorts of reasons, because it gives a number of European companies access to African markets, and it also, very importantly, has provided to a large extent stable regimes in a lot of that part of West Africa or Central Africa. And the fear is, of course, on the part of the European Union in particular, is that if these states are destabilized, then that could lead to all sorts of possible scenarios, such as, if it's a violent destabilization, then it could lead to mass exodus of people, and the likely route that they would take would be up through North Africa and into the European Union. And so there is a good deal of concern in the EU about what could happen next.
Jonathan, finally, I wondered, can you see a way back for France and Africa in terms of increasing, we'll use the word influence this time, its influence from the point it currently finds itself in?
From what I understand, the nature of French institutions themselves is in disarray. No one can really decide who's owning this agenda and who's supposed to be delivering that influence, countering mis and disinformation. And I think ultimately France lacks a game plan. I think, kind of picking up on John's point, this is actually creates an extremely unpredictable and potentially dangerous situation, not just for Francophonie, but for key British allies in Africa, not least Ghana, not least Nigeria. So all of a sudden, I think all the littoral West Africa, parts of Central Africa, and parts of North Africa are now in play for global power competition.
Jonathan makes a very good point there, because there is a sense in which all of this could become extremely contagious, and that France's position as an international power could be very seriously undermined. And that would have an impact not just on France, of course, but also on the West and on Britain in particular, because we have a very close military and to a certain extent political relationship with France that could be undermined if France is seen by many countries around the world as being ineffectual or unable to manage whatever she takes on internationally, and that they could then begin to back down and turn away much more from France than has been the case so far.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for joining us. The Daily Mail's Robert Hardman writes a letter from Balmoral in this week's magazine. And a year on from the Queen's death, he reflects on how best to remember her. He joins me now. Robert, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. You were recently in Scotland near Balmoral, a year on from the Queen's death. What was the mood like?
Our mood was reflective, but not particularly sentimental. I mean, the whole point of monarchy is sort of continuity. You can't sort of spend too much time celebrating or commemorating. You just got to get on with the job. I mean, clearly, on everyone's mind is, what were we doing this time last year? And obviously, the poignancy of being at Balmoral, where the Queen died, the first Queen and the first monarch, British monarch to die in Scotland, was on people's minds. But I think there's a sense that this is an important anniversary. It's important that it's sort of logged appropriately, but at the same time, and I kind of touch on this in my column in The Spectator, they are very conscious that the last 15 months, the royal family, the monarchy, has just been so in everyone's faces, first with the Platinum Jubilee last summer, and then obviously the death of Her Majesty, and then the coronation. That's a lot of sort of royal face time, and they're conscious that, that the public may have perhaps sort of had enough big royal events. So I think there's a very much a sense that it's important we acknowledge the passing of Her Majesty. A year is a key anniversary, but it's business as usual.
That's really interesting. So in terms of future memorials, what do you think we can expect? It will be quite subdued, or I suppose subtle?
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first anniversary after the death of Diana, actually, and everyone was slightly sort of, how are we going to address this? What's appropriate? And actually, I think the general mood in the public, among the public and at the palace as well, was, it's important to log these moments, but you can't dwell on it too much. You've got to move forward. I mean, I think the next big anniversary, really, and there was a sort of nod to that in the announcement a few days ago of the committee, which I've touched on in the piece, the committee to come up with a memorial to Elizabeth II. That committee will report back on her centenary, which will be April 2026. So I suspect that's, if you like, the moment when there already will be a big sort of focus on how do we remember this extraordinary figure. I mean, I don't know how. As I say in the piece, I don't envy the committee having to come up with an appropriate memorial, because she has been this, completely unprecedented, titanic figure in our modern history. And how you do justice to that legacy and that memory is a challenge.
And how do you think the Queen herself would have liked it to be marked?
I think she, as ever, no fuss, thanks very much. I mean, it is remarkable that when you look, people often compare Elizabeth II to Victoria. And in the later years of her life, Victoria was quite busy unveiling statues of herself, designing huge edifices to herself. Her mausoleum at Windsor is a great sort of exercise in, if you like, sort of memorialising oneself. Elizabeth II, on the other hand, had absolutely no interest in that sort of thing at all. It was really only very late in her reign that she started naming things after herself, and that's because other people asked if they could. And I think it says it all, that if you go to pay your respects in St George's Chapel, Windsor, to Elizabeth II, you won't find an Elizabeth II mausoleum, you won't find an Elizabeth II chapel, because she asked and always wanted to be buried in the King George VI Memorial Chapel. That's the sort of person she was.
And I suppose moving to the monarchy now, a year on, of course, we now have the king, a new king. Do you think the monarchy looks strong? There was quite interesting polling recently. I think there was often a lot of talk in recent years that if Prince of Wales took over, the public would turn against the monarchy. He would not be as popular as the Queen. And while perhaps personal popularity is one thing, it doesn't feel as though there's been a big shift or a big anti-monarchy sentiment.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think what the last year has reminded us is that actually the monarchy is a much stronger, much more resilient institution than many people had thought. You're absolutely right. People used to say, oh, well, it's all going to be changed, after Elizabeth II. People said much the same, actually, towards the end of Victoria's life. It's never going to be the same. But actually, Edward VII was a very popular king. The Edwardian era was a time of sort of general prosperity. But, the royal family went from strength to strength. And I think what we've learned over the last year is that, the institution is really... It's particularly in times of turbulence. I think the general political global situation has helped in a way, because when you think this time last year, in the space of 3 days, we lost both our head of government and our head of state, or rather we gained a new head of government, lost our head of state. And I mean, that's for a lot of countries, that's quite a dramatic seismic shift. But Britain just carried on, because that's what the monarchy does. We have this sort of parallel state apparatus, and the politicians all shout at each other and sort of do the grubby stuff. And meanwhile, the monarchy sort of holds everything together and it sort of don't panic. So I think what we have seen and what we'll continue to see is that actually, that King Charles is overwhelmingly more popular than any other politician, and the institution is overwhelmingly more popular than the alternative. And don't forget, even in 1952, when the Queen came to the throne, there was still about a fifth of the country didn't want a monarchy. There's a perfectly respectable Republican argument. There always has been and there always will be, but it's a minority sport at the moment.
Now, the other question, I think, about instability in the royal family was about Megxit, and what would happen if you did have, as has become the case, a royal living in another country, ultimately taking a very different approach in terms of their media, being quite public about their concerns. Do you think Prince Harry and Meghan Markle are particularly significant now to the future of the royal family, or has that slightly died down as it's gone on, people are losing interest?
I think the you look at the sales of Harry's book shows they're certainly not losing interest, but I do think that it hasn't. I think the narrative has settled. I think public view has settled. It was interesting that at the start of last autumn's first sort of noises off from Los Angeles with the Netflix series that Harry and Meghan put out, and then we had the various interviews that went with that. Then we had Harry's book and all the interviews that went with that. There was a fairly prolonged period of noise of the sort of Harry and Meghan agenda, but it didn't really change anything. The opinion polls didn't really shift. It didn't tell us anything we didn't know already, which was that they did not like royal life here. They particularly hate the British press. They didn't like being part of the royal machine. They wanted a new life. I think we all knew that. I think it's worth remembering that I did add up the sums the other day. They were a royal couple for whatever it was, 600 or 700 days. They've been a post-royal couple for twice that period now. There's only so much they can say about royal life as a couple, because, and I think we've probably heard it. So unless there's some,
something we're missing.
Unless, the one thing it was interesting reading Harry's book, Spare. There was quite a lot left out, which makes you think either there's possibly a sequel or perhaps Meghan's got a book up her sleeve. So maybe that's coming down the track. But no, I think their new life is now seems settled and it's accepted by the British public.
And just finally, going back to the new king, trip to France coming up, but do you think we can see a Commonwealth trip in the near future?
Well, we hope so. I mean, I'm told there will be one. There's been a lot of press speculation about Kenya as the first destination. We don't. I mean, it hasn't been confirmed. I don't know that, but it's certainly been widely tipped. And he's very conscious of the fact, he is head of the Commonwealth, and that's an important part of his role. The Commonwealth is sort of waiting to see what direction. He obviously doesn't have an executive role within it, but I mean, it's bigger than it's ever been. It's currently 56 member states. I mean, when the Queen took over in 52, it had 8 members, so it's gone up sevenfold, and it's got a waiting list. So it does matter. I think it's sort of felt a bit tired in recent years, the Commonwealth. I think it feels like it's sort of due for a bit of a booster. So a Commonwealth tour, I'm sure there will be one by the end of this year.
Great. Thank you, Robert, for joining Spectator TV today. And finally, these days Rory Stewart is known for his podcast that he does with Alistair Campbell, often near the top of the charts. So, of course, we recommend Coffee House Shots if you're looking for a political fix. But what about his political career? He details it in a new book, and I'm now joined by Chris Mullins, a former MP himself, to review Stewart's political career and whether a political comeback is possible. Chris, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. Now, you've reviewed Rory Stewart's memoir for the book section of the magazine. What was your verdict?
Oh, it's a very good book. It's an account of his 10 years in Parliament, and 10 turbulent years in Parliament. And it's quite a excoriating, really, account of our entire political system.
Yes, in your review, you mentioned how things didn't get off to a great start in terms of his ministerial career, because he decided to have his own opinions that did not match the government's when it came to House of Lords reform. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, yes. Cameron came up with a daft scheme that was, I think it was to placate the Lib Dems in the coalition for, I think, entirely abolishing the House of Lords. I don't think he meant it, but that's what he was contemplating. And Rory declined to go along with it. And just as he was about to go into the wrong lobby, George Osborne intercepts him and says, if you walk through that door, you will not. I shall make sure that you don't become a minister in the next 5 years or whatever. And he duly walks through the door, and he duly doesn't become a minister until Cameron and Osborne are out of the way.
How did it chime with your own experiences? Did anything in it surprise you in terms of how Rory Stewart found Parliament to work?
Well, the one thing that really does ring bells, so he's quite an extreme case. I think he held five ministerial offices in 4 years, really. One of them, the Secretary of State for International Development, he lasted only 3 months. And certainly it's been a feature of British governments now for some time that there's a constant turnover of ministers, with the result that or it's quite rare for anyone to stay anywhere long enough to actually achieve something. And he's a man who doesn't just go into office just in order to tick a box on his CV. He goes in fizzing with ideas. I'm sure not all of them are good ideas, but he's rapidly brought down to earth, and though he does have some achievements to his name, in particular when improbably he's put in charge of the prison service, and he decides that I think he actually is unwise enough to say that he'll resign unless he gets knife crime down in prisons over within, I don't know, a year or 18 months. And apparently he did. We only have his word for that, but apparently he did. But So he did achieve something, albeit that his tenure was short.
I remember interviewing Rory Stewart when he was thinking about going for the leadership in one of the many Tory leadership campaigns we've had, and he gave an example I think that always stuck with me, which is effectively, I said, why do you think you would be a good prime minister? And he said there's lots of things he knew he'd not be very good at. I think he listed ballet and being a ballerina as something he would not naturally be good at, but he thought he had what it took to be a good leader. Reading the book, do you think that he would have been a good prime minister had the Tory party let him?
Well, of course, he is an Etonian, and he comes with that sense of entitlement. It is assumed almost from the outset that he will become a minister, and that in due course he will rise, as indeed he did in a rather chaotic way. There is never any chance, not the slightest chance, of someone of his energy and views becoming prime minister. And so we shall never know, nor it was never likely that we would discover that.
And it's interesting what you say about, another OE Old Etonian there, almost, just thinking you, of course, are going to enter government and climb that ladder, and perhaps being frustrated that it doesn't happen for the period of the David Cameron government after he chooses to rebel. Do you think it is a problem in our political system that so many MPs, want to be ministers? Or is that just natural? Because we just had a week of a Labour reshuffle, and Rishi Sunak has delayed perhaps a wider reshuffle. And it does seem to occupy a lot of MPs' time just thinking about whether they will be promoted or not.
Yes, I'm sure that there's a lot too much time wasted on who's up and who's down and speculation about that. And indeed, he complains about a lot of that. The gossip in the tea rooms is never about policy. It's always about who's up and who's down. But there is a perfectly satisfactory, in my view, alternative career path now in politics, and that is it wasn't always the case, and that is the select committees. And actually, Rory, as I did tread that path. I was chairman of the Home Affairs Select Committee on and off for 4 years, and he becomes chairman of the Defence Committee, I think, to the consternation of the military wing of the Tory party. He might have had more influence in that capacity than he ever would have done as a junior minister. I've no doubt at all that I had more influence as chairman of the Home Affairs Committee than I did in at least the first 2 jobs I did in government.
And then just finally, I wondered what you think, what next for Rory Stewart? You suggest that he is unlikely, as you say, to become a prime minister, a leader, or even return to parliament. He obviously has a popular podcast. I don't know if that is, the sole best use of his talents going forward. What do you think we might be able to expect from him in the future, or that you would like to see him do?
Well, who knows? He appears to have a lot of opportunities available to him. He is a politician with hinterland, and I'm occasionally asked by young people who are keen to get into Parliament how they should go about it. My answer to them is always the same, though not necessarily the one they wish to hear, and that is go away and do something else first, and then you might be useful when you get in. Well, Rory Stewart got into Parliament at about the same age as I did. I think I was 39, and he wasn't far off that one way or the other. And he'd already done a lot of things and seen a lot of the world. Now he's back in that world. And I think he's going to find it rather frustrating because he's back in the world of commentating again rather than doing. And for someone of his energy and with so many ideas, I'm sure he will find that frustrating. On the other hand, he does have a habit of popping up in all sorts of unlikely places. But the one place I predict confidently he will not be popping up again is in domestic politics.
Okay, we'll hold you to that. Thank you, Chris. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.